Hello, everybody. Welcome to Disability Innovation Live. It's fantastic to have you all joining us for the session today. So today we're going to be looking at tomorrow's Disability Innovation Pioneers, and really that's to look at some of the PhD research ideas and technologies that we have happening at the GDI Hub and some of our partner institutions. So just a little bit of context for today, there is closed captions available. So to turn those on, there'll be a button possibly at the bottom of the top of your screen where you can just activate the closed captioning. We have the Q&A box open. So if you have any questions for any of our panelists or any general thoughts or feedback through the session, please do just pop it in the Q&A section. And the panelists will be answering those as we go, and then we'll also be coming to a Q&A section at the end of the session as well. So we'll be answering some of those key questions there. And we will be doing recording this and providing a transcript as well. So those will all be available after the session. So Disability Innovation Live, it's really an opportunity for us at the GDI Hub to share our knowledge and experiences in disability innovation, and that's very much bringing in both our expertise and that of all our delivery partners around the world and in the UK. And we look to share the stories behind the innovations and the people behind the products. And it's really about having a bit of an informal space so we can just give you a bit more in-depth understanding of what's happening behind the scenes and some of our own ideas and reflections, and also to get your feedback and input as well. So just a little bit of information for you on the Global Disability Innovation Hub. We are a research and practice centre driving disability innovation for a fairer world. We were born out of the London 2012 Paralympic Legacy Programme, and we're both a community interest company and an academic research centre within UCL. We currently have programmes across 35 different countries and are kind of on target to reach 15 million people by 2022. So it's quite a big project and quite a lot of activity happening across all our different regions and our networks, which are really focused around kind of assistive technology, inclusive design, and culture and participation. So we've got a number of different panelists joining the session today. We've got Professor Catherine Holloway, who is the academic director and one of the founders of the GDI Hub. And we have Tiggy and Mariam and Victor, who will all be sharing a bit more information about their specific PhDs, which are all focused around innovations for visual impairments. So there's a really nice theme coming across today. So we'll be able to see some nice, interesting relationships between those different areas of work. So I'm now going to hand across to my colleague Kathy, who's just going to talk in a little bit more detail around some of the PhD research within the GDI Hub.
Yeah, hi everybody, welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm delighted. It's probably the most exciting GDI Hub Live event for me because I feel that our PhD research is possibly some of the most important research that we do. The GDI Hub has PhD researchers across multiple topics and subjects. So as Louise mentioned, we are an academic research centre. And as part of that academic research centre, UCL leads the centre, but we have academic partners in the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design, in London College of Fashion, and in Loughborough University. And today we've pulled 3 PhD students who are nearing completion or kind of a long way into their PhD around the topic of blind and partially sighted people and technologies to help blind and partially sighted people. So hopefully you'll enjoy that particular topic, but also get to know a little bit about the kind of research that we do, which is also across other areas as well. We find, well, I personally believe that PhD students are essential to our mission for driving new knowledge and thinking in this emerging area of disability innovation. We see our PhD students as the future leaders of this space and wish to do everything we can to help them find the route that they want, as well as the support that they need to become the leaders that we know that they are. Our PhDs sit along our wider research. So we have a lot of research, and we also have an MSc in Disability Design and Innovation. And both Tiggy and Mariam this year are helping me with my module for accessibility and assistive technology within the MSc programme. And we also now have MSc students that have graduated from our programme joining us as PhD students. So our PhD students get exposed to research, they get to join some of the large research programmes that we're in, and they also get to learn better how to teach and how to disseminate knowledge through activities within our MSc programme. In order to study a PhD at the Global Disability Innovation Hub, you have to go through one of our founding partner institutions. So you need to find a supervisor within Loughborough University, London College of Fashion, the Helen Hamlin Centre of Design, or UCL, and submit a proposal. And the best way to do that is to come through the UCL, come through the GDI Hub, website, reach out to somebody like Louise or myself with a proposal. Maybe just a paragraph of an idea in your CV, and then we feed that into the academic board, and then can help you through the submission process in each of the institutions. So in terms of what do people do when they leave a PhD, so we've been active centre since 2016, so we're only beginning to have PhD students graduate and go out into the world, but we found that they have become some people have come into GDI Hub CIC. So Rhys Williams graduated as a PhD student and is now leads innovation insights for us within the CIC, working very closely on the Assistive Technology Impact Fund, which is launching soon. Whereas other of our PhD students have stayed within the research space, and some go on to work in companies like Microsoft or with NGOs, or even now we're beginning to see people come to us, international organizations like the WHO come to us and say, we're looking for more researchers in this space, do you have anybody? And that would be a particularly good opportunity for PhD students as they graduate. But any of the PhD students, I think Victor's just taking up a job in the NHS. So, do reach out to us and to the PhD students in particular, because they'll always be willing to share their story and where they think they're going if you do wish to join us. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the talks. I believe I'm coming back in at the end to say, try and pull out some themes. So until then, I shall say goodbye and thank you again.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kathy, for that introduction. And I think it's really interesting for everyone just to hear a little bit about the pipeline for studying PhDs as part of the Global Disability Innovation Hub, but also some of those onward trajectories for some of our graduates and people that are moving forward from completing their PhDs into the next stage of their careers. So I wanted to introduce now Tiggy. So I'll leave you to tell us a bit more about you, Tiggy, and a little bit about some of the work that you're doing around tactile displays.
All right, thank you, Louise. Hello, everybody. My name is Tigmanshu Bhatnagar, but as you can all know from now, you can also call me Tiggy. I am a third-year PhD student at the Global Disability Innovation Hub, supervised by Kathy Holloway, and Dr. Nikolai Marquardt from UCLIC, that is UCL Interaction Center, and Professor Mark Miodovanik from the Institute of Making at UCL as well. So my interest lies in developing and designing haptic interfaces for disability interactions. And in this particular PhD, I'm focusing on the design and development of a novel, refreshable, multiple line braille and tactile graphic display. So I'll be talking a little bit about tactile graphics and braille before moving into the details of my project. So Louise, to the next slide, please. So tactile displays, essentially the tactile route of information for blind and partially sighted learners is absolutely crucial for not just understanding the concepts in education, but also for better chances in profession later on. So in this slide, there are a lot of images around the ways in which tactile displays essentially are available at the moment. So there are static displays such as braille, which is very familiar to most of us, but also raised line tactile graphics that can be developed on specific plastic films. But also now 3D printing is becoming a prominent sort of mechanism to develop tactile displays, especially those that are static. But when we move into more refreshable or reconfigurable tactile displays, then a majority of the technology of the devices uses the piezoelectric tactile display technology. So this in this image, you can actually see a piezoelectric actuator that basically is used to actuate a particular braille cell. But when we think about multiple lines of braille, this technology becomes rather expensive and complicated to develop devices into. So there's an active research field in investigating new actuators and technologies that can be useful for multiple lines of braille and tactile graphics, and refreshable form of them. So there's investigation in new materials, but also new mechanisms and designs. And that is more or less where my interest also lies. So to the next slide, Luis. The current design thinking of developing tactile displays is that we first figure out the technology that is going to actuate a single pin in an array of pins. And then we sort of replicate that technology in a closely packed array. However, to the next slide, Luis, we propose a different concept that rather than actually looking into the technology for a particular pin, we go layer by layer. So we figure out the entire layer or the entire array at once in a single layer. So there could be multiple layers that actually achieve the eventual effect of a tactile display. For example, one layer could be a passive shape-changing material, whereas the other two layers either stimulate the material to change its particular shape or reconfigure to back to its flat shape. So in the next slide, here you can see a video of a passive shape-changing layer that we have developed using a single sheet of nitinol. So I don't know if the video would play or not, but I can just talk through it.
Louise, if you click on the video.
Okay, yeah, there you see. So what we have basically developed is this sheet of, all these small little pixels, these tactile pixels are cut from a single sheet using a cold laser, and they are trained to bend out of plane when they are subjected to heat stimulus. So essentially when they're heated above 50 degrees Celsius, in this case, just using a soldering iron, they bend out of plane and create some kind of a tactile impression. So as you can see, as you could see in that video, they can be selectively actuated and the heat doesn't dissipate. So we have been able to actually figure out the mechanics of developing such passive shape-changing layers. In the next slide, if I can see the presentation again. Okay. To the next slide, Luis. Thank you. It's having its moment. Yeah. All right. Never mind. With the other video, I just wanted to say that it's also completely reconfigurable. So with a small amount of force, we can completely bring back the pixels to their flat configuration. So currently, with the present design, we can raise the pixels 0.3 millimeters out of the surface and create 0.25 kilograms of force, which is more than sufficient, I think, for even vigorous braille reading. And with 0.14 kilogram of force, that is the resistive force that the pixels can still resist even when they are back to their cool state. So it requires around 50 degrees to actuate the pixels, but below 40 degrees, they can be brought back to their flat state. But if they are not forced, they still maintain that position. So with this, there's an interesting application that we are starting to develop. The next one, please, Luis. Of a erasable tactile drawing. So tactile drawing at this stage is a little hard to basically create, especially the erasable form of tactile drawing, which can lead to better understanding of geometrical principles and also better performances in understanding concepts of mathematics. So if we can play the video. So this project is being conducted in collaboration with IIT Delhi as a UCL IITD Strategic Partnership Seed Fund. And Professor PVM Rao from IIT Delhi, Anshul and Vikas, his brilliant PhD students are also part of this project. So we have developed a hot air pen essentially to smoothly raise the pixels on the sheet, with which we are able to create any form of tactile drawings manually. So right now, as you can see, the pen just simply glides over the surface, blowing control the pen with their writing hand. So here you could see that I try to write UCL on the sheet. Never mind, let's move on to what's going to happen next. So the next task in my PhD, in the time that is left, I'll be trying to develop a reconfigurable tactile screen, which can be introduced into a device such as this, that can present multiple lines of braille and tactile graphics on a tablet-like form. So we have received support from UCL Business Social Enterprise for its proof of concept. And as we believe that in order to make a real sort of societal impact from the technology that we are trying to make, it needs to reach to the hands of people. And that's what we have started off for, in order to make it at such a level that it can actually be commercialized and marketable. So if any of you in the audience is also interested to help us in that journey into realization of this product, into a thing that actually helps people and helps students to learn better, please do send me an email, and I would really like to have a chat with you. So that's it from my end. I think might have overshot a few minutes, but thanks a lot for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tiggy, for that. Apologies for a few technical errors there, just trying to get those videos up and working. But I hope you got to kind of the idea there of the impact of this kind of tactile approach, and actually how much of a kind of step forward this is, and what an opportunity as well. So it's really interesting kind of in this area of work, Tiggy, just to see some of the developments that have already been made. And I know you're working with some kind of international partners as well on it, and some other areas of similar work. It'd be quite interesting. We can maybe touch on that in the Q&As at the end of the session as well. So we're now going to move on to hear from Miriam, who's also been working in the space around kind of visual impairments, but on quite a different kind of I guess kind of area of research around open spaces and experiences within them. So Miriam, I'll hand across to you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mariam, and I'm a final year PhD student at the UCL Interaction Center in GDI Hub. And my PhD research is supervised by Professor Catherine Holloway, Professor Nadia Bertuz, and Dr. Anisha Singh. My research intersects human-computer interaction, disability and inclusive design, and assistive technology fields, in which I explore the experiences of blind and partially sighted people in open spaces, the barriers that limit these experiences, and the role of technology in supporting open space engagement. So Louise, next slide, please. So why open spaces, and why blind and partially sighted people? So we know that sight loss is a growing global problem, and with an aging population, WHO World Report on Vision suggests that the number of people living with sight loss is expected to double by 2050. And while through orientation and mobility training, many blind people are able to independently navigate their daily routes, accessing open spaces is still a challenge. So we also found that while nature experiences and explorations are studied extensively in literature, not many studies focus on multisensory embodied experiences of blind and partially sighted people. So here on this slide, you can see pictures from 3 previous studies conducted that are found in human-computer interaction literature called Ambient Wood, which looked at engagement in open spaces for children, and education about nature and nature exploration. The second one is called Talking Plants, in which they implemented Internet of Things to make the plants talk about their conditions. And the third one is Footnotes, which looked at which enhanced the experiences of blind people in built environment navigation by providing not only auditory information about their routes, but also superimposing social information, like if there is a fountain on the way, then they would give you some information about that particular fountain, when it was put in place, and what the history around that fountain is, for example. So next slide, please. So the first phase of my research included interviews and focus group sessions with blind and partially sighted people, and we developed the Places framework, which expands the concept of outdoor leisure as a multi-phase approach, including planning, accessing, engaging, recollection, and sharing experiences with others. So next slide, please. So in planning, when planning the visit, the participants prefer to be familiar with different characteristics of the place, for example, the routes, trails, terrains, and other points of interest. However, they felt the information wasn't easily available and accessible for them, so that many people felt they couldn't contribute to the planning process and had to rely on their sighted companions for information. So one of the quotes on the slides here is that one of the participants said that their family usually decided where they were going and they felt that they couldn't contribute to what the place that they were going to look like, particularly if they're talking about the holidays in natural environments or day trips. Next slide, please. So when accessing the parks or open spaces, finding the entrance was particularly difficult, as one of the participants said that usually open spaces have different entrances. There's a south side and the north side, and people found the entrance to the park, finding the entrance to the park was quite difficult. And also the navigation inside the park was particularly difficult because of the lack of appropriate wayfinding information. And many of our participants worried about getting lost and when they were inside the park, and they avoided visiting parks without sighted companions. Next slide, please. So once people arrived at the park, in terms of engaging with the open space environment and the immersive experience, they enjoyed the plants and the bird life of the area. They explored the environment on their own and with support from sighted companions to immerse in nature and using auditory, tactile, and olfactory senses. Particularly visualizing mental images of the environment was important for participants who experience progressive vision loss later in life. So they could see before and then they wanted to sort of recapture that visual representation of the environment in their mind. Next slide, please. For sharing, particularly when sharing, participants, they recorded, the sounds of the environment. Some of the participants that we spoke to tried to record 3D sounds of the environment as they navigated the space, but they felt that they were not able to capture the whole embodied experience as they experienced it while they were in there, because the quality of the sounds that they experienced, along with the tactile and olfactory sensations, they were not able to translate that into recordings when they heard it back. Even so, when they heard the recordings, they were able to sort of reflect and recollect a lot of that experience that that reminded them of being in that space. Next slide, please. So the overarching concept of contribution emerged throughout the different phases of planning, accessing, and engaging and sharing. Participants talked about the sense of ownership and contribution in making their own experiences, but also sharing that experience with other people. So they talked about sharing information about routes, place accessibility, and with people with different abilities. Helping each other to synergize and augment each other's experience. For example, one of the participants talked about how long cane users could potentially help wheelchair users and vice versa in exploring open spaces, so that they could potentially, the long cane user could help the wheelchair user becoming more mobile, and similarly wheelchair users could describe the environment to them and co-creating that sort of immersive experience for each other. Some of the participants also talked about creating narrative stories of experiences for people who are housebound and unable to get out and about. So one of the participants who actually creates these auditory newsletters described, the work as the people that listen to it are pretty much housebound and in some cases very isolated. And we heard from a lady who said that we were the only friends that she had over for Christmas. And to me, if there's one person that feels that, then it's worth doing. So it highlights the importance of the the contribution, the sense of contribution that participants felt, but also how how meaningful that was for the people that they shared with. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps for my research, we're now exploring how technology can support co-creation of rich and embodied experiences for blind and between people with different visual abilities. So different people on the spectrum of visual abilities from sighted to totally blind, and capturing the sights, sounds, touch, and smells of the spaces and how these multisensory experiences can be shared with others so that they can perceive, experience, and engage with nature in diverse ways. We've also recently been awarded the UCL Culture Beacons Bursary, and in this project, we will focus on East London communities and particularly blind and partially sighted people within East London, and explore how they engage with open spaces in East London and form connections and attachments with natural spaces. And we will work with them to co-create, to facilitate co-creation of their experiences and sharing of these experiences with their family members and friends and other, a blind community in the wider East London. Next slide, please. So I wanted to also mention the workshop that we're planning. Myself, Kathy, and other supervisors and co-organizers from different institutions in the UK are planning a workshop on multisensory embodied experiences and disability interactions at the upcoming ACM CHI workshop in May. I've added a QR code here, but I will also share the link to the website so that if people are interested in finding more about it, or they want to share a position paper or concept to this workshop. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the webinar or through email. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was really, really interesting. And what especially highlight for me was just hearing a bit around the importance that you highlighted at the start of your presentation around decision making and ownership, but also that access and ability to engage with kind of open spaces and some of the challenges around that, things like the entrances and the sounds. I think that all came across really strongly and really interesting work, and particularly fascinating to see then what happens next as you talk about some of those kind of ongoing work that you've just received some grant funding for as well. So maybe we can touch back on that maybe later in the year and find out how it's all going. So I'm next going to introduce Victor, or potentially Victor to introduce himself. He's going to talk a little bit around his work around guide running.
Right, hello, I presume everyone can hear me and all that lovely stuff. Right, so I am from Loughborough University. My PhD is obviously about guide running. And I finished this PhD actually in December. So it's all wrapped up, all in a nice bow, and hopefully it'll be accessible soon. If you still want to read a whole big thesis, that might put you to sleep. Who knows, good bedtime story. But yes, but recently I've just been approved for a job as a behavioral researcher looking into COVID. So, you know, some people are not necessarily adhering to the COVID rules. So how do you make sure? Oh, I'm afraid I'm struggling to hear this. Trying to sound that's quite painful to listen to. Hello, should I be worried about this?
Hi, Victor. We're just getting a little bit of interference on the line. I don't know if you can come a bit closer to your microphone, or if you can just set up slightly differently. There's an echo coming through at the moment.
How about now?
That's a lot better. Thank you. That's brilliant.
Well, now you get to see my big face.
No, it's fantastic. Sure. Thank you, Victor. Right.
Okay, I should apologize. I'm in a slightly echoey lab at the moment, so that might be the issue. Right, so as I was saying, sudden job in NHS, looking into COVID, we'll see what happens, all that fun stuff. But yes, starting off this talk, I'll be actually giving a video presentation. This actually involves a lot of pictures that I put up on screen, but actually we wrote this for the vision impaired. So it's actually a bedtime story first, and then there's just pretty watercolor pictures on top. So you're not exactly missing much. In terms of our closed captioning, the YouTube video does have closed captioning already enabled on it. So if our lovely CDI Hub can set it up.
2 seconds, we're just going to get the video running for you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll mute myself for now.
Hello, I struggle to talk about my PhD for 5 to 10 minutes, as I find the time segments a little bit too tight to explain what I want to. So instead, I want to tell the story I always tell in pubs when I want people to understand the value of my work. So I hope you're all tucked in and have your hot chocolate ready, as it's time for a PhD-related bedtime story. A long time ago, during my MSc in Ergonomics and Inclusive Design, there was a tool called the running line. The running line was a new tool that was very basic, allowing blind children to run in a straight line independently. It consisted of a pair of plastic fence posts jabbed into the ground with a long rope spanning from one side to the other. Threaded through the rope was a sliding handle, and with it, a blind child could hold onto it and run from one fence post to the other safely. To tell the runner when they were reaching the end, we threaded a tambourine into the line, which would jingle when you hit it, telling the runner that they were close to the end of the rope and it was time to slow down. My project back then was to ask the relatively simple question if kids would enjoy the running line, or would they find it too scary? Because if a kid hates it, there was no point developing it any further. So we went to a specialist school to test it out. The experiment was as follows. We introduced the running line by asking the child to walk up and down the line while holding the handle. Then we let them run up and down, and finally we asked them if they wanted to race the experimenter. If they said yes, we counted it as a win, as the kid clearly wanted to run more. Also, because it was a scientific experiment, we had to be consistent, which meant no matter how slow the kid was, I always had to lose the race. It was a lovely sunny day when we set up in the school. 2 running lines were set up, so we could not only run more trials, but also it meant that the children weren't just sitting around all day waiting for their turn. The first child came forward. In her right hand was her cane, and in her left hand she was holding onto her carer. She was tiny, with red bushy hair, wearing her summer school uniform. We introduced her to the running line, but she refused to walk. She was too scared. Eventually we convinced her to walk down the running line, with one hand holding the line and the other hand holding onto our sports coach. On her second attempt, she still didn't feel safe. But she walked with one hand holding the line, while our sports coach rested his hand on her shoulder as reassurance. Her third and final walk, she finally walked solo. We then let her sit down without her racing me, as it was clear she was uncomfortable about the whole thing. This was a gut-wrenching experience for our team, because we thought that if all the kids were like this, this would be the end of the running line. Fortunately, the other kids really enjoyed it. The ones waiting were cheering from the sidelines, and they all wanted an extra go racing the experimenter. And as planned, I lost every race. Afterwards, the PE teacher came to thank us. He was impressed by the tool, as he managed to get the kids run much further than they normally would on an average PE session. In fact, when looking at the kids, they were exhausted on the floor on the grass, but happy, with carers rushing around looking for glasses of water just for them. Then the PE teacher made a special point to thank us for the first child, the child we thought we failed. He explained the reason why she was so reserved was because she had a slightly interesting childhood and was always afraid, which is why she always walked with a carer and a cane and never walked alone. The short walk that she did with the running line was actually the furthest she's ever walked alone, and this was a major achievement for her. It was an important lesson for us all that day. Our methods technically would have classified her as a loss, but in reality, it was perhaps one of the biggest wins of the day and showed the importance of our research and the value of not making these presumptions and the complexity of the subject. Now the running line has received a bit more polish and travelled around the country helping blind and partially sighted children across the UK to access sport. It is now donated to 2 different help children years to come. The research also acted as the catalyst of starting my PhD working on how do people guide run in the first place, and if it can be done independently around a 400-meter running track. By the way, the answer is yes. You can guide people independently around a running track. And much like this story, what I expected to happen didn't happen, and I was proven wrong in the best way possible. But that's a story for another time, when I have more time to talk. The end.
Just get you all back going again on the presentation. Just bear with me 1 second.
No worries. Hopefully this time without the echo from me or whatever sound issue there was there. Uh-oh.
What contribution can behavioral science research make?
Might want to mute yourself. Right. Forced to attend this. Mike Higgins, I will address that later if you don't mind. Right. Still waiting on screens and stuff like that, but you know what? I can talk about screens if that's an issue. No, we're running, going, all the magical stuff. Right. So, as I have a bit more time to talk, I'll actually talk about my research about guide running. Let's see. Running, as you know, is a simple act of a blind, partially sighted person traveling at speed through an environment, typically with a piece of rope called a tether. Now, the PhD.
Sorry, Victor, you're just breaking up a bit again. Maybe if you can just come a little bit closer to the computer, we should be able to hear you.
Yep, sure. I'm just aware of how big my nose is.
No, that's okay. You only come up small on the screen because we've got the presentation. It just makes a huge difference to the sound quality.
Of course. So the PhD actually stemmed from the running line as the original aim was to develop almost the second generation of the running line, allow runners to run around the athletics track. This would include keeping people in lane and also tackling complicated things like bends. Next slide. Now, we thought we could easily tap into the mountains of data on the subject. Next slide. But when it came to the literature review, we found there's actually nothing for us to use directly at all. Research Mountain just simply doesn't exist. So we switched gears and started building the foundation of knowledge on guide running. So the first step was to interview a load of people. Next slide, please. And interview all the stakeholders involved in guide running. This involved guides and coaches and runners. The runners were from all different backgrounds, ranging from Paralympics all the way to casual runners. Eyesight varied as well in terms of severity of sight loss and the age of sight loss, which what turned out to be an important factor. Next slide, please. Here's a taste of what we found. We found out how people mixed up instructions or guide running. We found how people can get in the way. As a guide runner pair, you're twice the width of a normal runner. And try to get someone out of the way in front of you who's got the headphones on, that's terrible. They also discussed how important landmarks and milestones are while running, and also how to deal with curbs. Next slide, please. They were also talked about issues of finding guides. Yes, you might find one guide, but that one guide could be only available on Wednesday. So you might have two guides, but that other guide might be on holiday. So you end up making a list of guides. Naturally, also what was discussed was trips and falls and side preferences. Now, obviously, this required a lot of traveling and meeting up with people, as it was realized to get the diversity needed to stick to our, obviously, it required a lot of travel because we realized sticking to our local area was not good enough. Now, this was all very interesting, but doesn't answer how guide running is actually performed, as it's a very hard thing to describe. Next slide. So again, I jumped in my car. This time I met up with running pairs at their local running track. Next slide. I did this by asking pairs to run in 5 unique ways. Each altered what side the guide was on and whether the runner was able to talk. There was even a method that asked the guide not to hold on to the runner, but only be guided verbally. I've lost my own paperwork. Here we go. In each case, the recording was, sorry, I've lost myself a bit. In each case, after the recording was made, we did an interview and we also performed a mental workload assessment. Next slide. The pair was also motion tracked. So as they ran around the track, we could tell how near or how far they were at any time. And we also recorded what they were saying as they were running, because that really helped us understand what guide running was all about. Next slide. So we found out a lot of things, one of which was side preference really does make a difference. As best as I can, whoa, everywhere. One forward slide. Yep, stay there. What was found that side preference really made a difference. As best as I could describe it, if you put the guide on the wrong side, it must feel like writing with your non-dominant hand. All sense of proprioception is lost, and you can't really feel what your guide is doing. Next slide. Also, we asked guides to run silently, so not saying a word, and that proved to be a horrible experience because the runner lost all cues of where they were on the track. They couldn't really tell when they're on a bend or a straight because there's no real distinguishing features, especially on such long bends and such long straights. Next slide. Surprisingly though, running with only verbal guidance proved to be not only doable, but in some cases an amazing experience, especially for those who lost sight later in life. So in one example, we had a person who lost her sight in less than a month at the age of 40. And she never thought she would be able to run independently again. But the notion of just giving her verbal instructions and encouraging her was really, really life-changing for her. She actually broke down into tears afterwards, tears of joy, I should be clear, which actually wasn't something we factored into our risk assessment. So next slide, please. So what we learned, however, from these observations was that instructions are really like top tier level stuff. So telling someone when to start running is very important. That overrides all other information. Next slide. Also important information is saying when you're about to change trajectory, such as when you're about to enter a bend. Next slide. And also important is telling them when they're drifting away too much. Those are real important stuff. But next slide. But there's also other information that is not essential, but equally important, such as, next slide, tactics, such as saying, do you want to pick up the pace? We also have location, such as saying that we're a third of the way along the straight. Next slide. Encouragement, such as saying you're doing great or you're doing a good job. Encouragement is very important because in times when you're doing something perfectly, the last thing you want to hear is just silence because that can be scary and confusing. And next slide. And obviously there's conversations, just having a chat. Guide running is a sociable thing. You have a friend, you have a partner with you all the way. Next slide. But these things ultimately are secondary because whenever there's an instruction to give, all those suddenly stop for you then to actually talk about, to actually give instructions. Next slide. So that second study was very important. We actually conducted a third study, which ultimately was only there to just double check what we saw actually happened and just repeated it. So there's not much to tell you on that one. But ultimately, next slide, please. This led to us actually mapping out what guide running is on a 400-meter running track, and the importance of what data should be delivered when and where, and how to sustain guide running, and ultimately the barriers to accessing the sport. Next slide. Obviously, as any PhD is, this was a relatively huge undertaking, but at the end of the day, it does create a foundation for other people to build on, to build an understanding of what guide running is, and ultimately what wayfinding is. Next slide. And yeah, that's my talk about guide running. I do hope you enjoy it. I apologize for all the technical issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. I'm just going to get you back on my screen. I seem to have lost the session. 1 second. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think it was really interesting just to see the context of how you came about kind of focusing on this as your PhD study and the learnings at the first stage, and then how you've taken this through to looking a bit more in depth at the topic as well. And some of those key elements you brought through around kind of not making assumptions and about the different elements that make a huge difference in the confidence of people being able to excel within that running space, and what different factors go into that as well. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And those wonderful watercolors. It's fantastic just to see the graphics there, which I know you did yourself as well, so absolutely brilliant. I'm now going to hand across to Kathy, just to give a bit of a summary. I think what we've heard today has been 3 very different research projects on completely different areas around visual impairments and innovations, and learnings and understanding around those different elements. So it'd be really interesting, Kathy, just to hear kind of any common themes or any reflections you may have to share.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Louise. And I think one of the things that's been coming through to me is around co-design, actually. I've been thinking a lot about how we design technologies with blind and partially sighted people. And I know, Victor, I don't know your work as well, but I know Mariam and Tiggy spent a lot of time, so Tiggy in schools and Mariam in open places and across the Olympic Park, and working with blind and partially sighted groups across London and East London in particular, to understand what the problems that they were still faced. So one of the things that I'd love to hear more about in the Q&A is sort of, what do people feel about the solutions that are coming forward? Are they things you expect universities like us to be doing? Are there other things you would prefer us to do? And the other thing around that co-design is also contribution. So when we worked, Mariam's places framework, the C in the middle of the places about contribution is incredibly important, I think, and is often sort of not taken. We don't take as much care to. We think that accessibility is simply about giving people the right to access, rather than the right to maybe be creative and contribute. And I think the idea that people should also have the right to obviously exercise freely as they want to, the right to education and being creative. So one of the things I love about Tiggy's invention is the fact it allows people to create rather than just absorb information. So it goes both ways, which is, I think, quite novel. And also the work that Mariam's doing around multimodal interactions for exploring open spaces, I think really opens up the door to using, it just happens that some people have sight loss, but that means that we begin to explore other options of understanding the space that we're in. So we might use smell, or we might use hearing, we might use tactile experience. And I believe that if we made those experiences more inclusive, it wouldn't just help visually impaired people, blind or partially sighted people, it would help everybody, because that richer experience across an open space and guidance across open spaces would be interesting. So I've realized there's a few Q&A, one question coming in. Jess has loaded something. I'd definitely open up to more comments as well, so Q&A, but shall I hand back over to you, Louise, to help us through the Q&A session?
Absolutely. So we might just quickly touch on, there's a few questions that came in via the chat. We actually turned the chat off for the participants to see the chat amongst yourselves, just because the screen readers read them out and it's quite disruptive for the presentation. So thank you for those that have contacted directly on the chat, which has come through to the panelists. I know that we had someone just comment particularly on the tactile icons, saying that some of the challenges can be around the size of the icons, and that sometimes they're too big on those kind of maps, and therefore as you're looking at them with a finger, they're actually too large to digest in that format. So I think there was a little bit of conversation just around some potential opportunities for looking at ways that could be overcome, whether that's using other opportunities around kind of audio maps as well, but also some kind of different tactile icons as well. So that was quite an interesting comment that came through that I know the team will be keen to pick up with that later on. And I think just generally people was just some really interesting reflections on some of the presentations, talking just a little bit around those open spaces and the accessibility of them. So yeah, apologize again as well for the sound problems we had in that one. But I think what would be quite interesting to do before we move on to the direct Q&As is we were just going to ask, I know there's quite a few people that have joined today who are maybe quite early stage in their careers or are thinking about moving into the disability innovation space. So I think to start off the discussion, it would be quite interesting just to hear what advice our kind of panelists today would give to students kind of looking to pursue a career in disability innovation, and particularly kind of within the academic space. So as a starting point, maybe Tiggy, will come to you just to hear if you've got any reflections or advice you want to share with people that are maybe starting out on that journey, maybe kind of in education at the moment or in the workplace, and maybe looking to go into the kind of academic side of disability innovation.
Well, I think to begin with, one interesting thing would be to really dive into the challenge of sort of working with disability interactions. I think it's a very challenging field, like most of the other fields are, but there is a certain complexity when we're thinking about disability interactions, especially because it deals with not just the invention and the person interacting with the invention, but also all the other societal and social and emotional aspects around that particular interaction. So I think within academia, this is a very safe place where we can really put forth some breakthroughs or really ideas that can really push things forward, which are very difficult in the industry at this moment, because the assistive technology industry is not as fast growing as the other industries are. But there are various different reasons for that. And I think we're still trying to understand how to make that grow further. But within academia, I mean, it's a very nice place to really experiment and try different and new things that might not see the day, light of the day in the industry. And really some new inventions can come out from there. So I think if people have that kind of a confidence and courage to experiment something new, academics is a really good place to do that. Having spoken that, it's also important to have a very user-centered approach within the entire development cycle. So even if we are doing hardcore engineering, development and design, it is good to have a user-centric cycle that informs us about the problem, and also a strong evaluation of whatever we do at the end of it. So that it's very hard to visualize how it is to be a disabled person, and being with them and kind of generating the empathy is essentially very important when it comes to designing anything. I think more important than other fields in this particular case. So I think these are the 2 points that comes to my mind straight off at the moment, Reese.
Thank you, Tiki. So I might go across to you, Marion, because it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, I guess, what inspired you and first motivated you to kind of move into this space. And we've also had a question come in to the Q&A, very much just asking around the kind of mental presentations of physical spaces. And the question is just asking around what are the most important and frequent kind of mental presentations to have a good experience, and do we have kind of any data or understanding about how we could go about creating them or generating those to kind of improve experiences?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Yes, I think that's a really interesting question about mental representations of different spaces, because I think in my research, what I've found is that it's really dependent on people and their preferences and their own, you know, their previous experiences and how and what they want to engage with. But most of the representations that sort of came through the data were trying to make sense of what's around them. So if there are any interesting things, so some people are interested in the plant life, so different kind of flowers, what kind of colors there were, what kind of sizes, and some people were interested in far away sort of aspects of things. So if they're visiting a cultural heritage site, or if they're hiking on a mountain or a hill somewhere, then they were interested in getting that experience of, okay, what does the look beyond the current space, you know, what does that look like, and what it would be like to experience, you know, that space. So particularly it's quite interesting though. I mean, it's not easy. It's not simple enough to say that like some people who experience sight loss later in life, you know, they were interested in it. It was quite prevalent in sort of that in that data from people who lost with later life sight loss. But we had some participants who never had vision, but they were still interested in, you know, how different aspects of the environment were interacting. So there was an example of one participant, a young person, who was quite interested in fashion and different textures and different colors and colors of the spaces that she visited as well, and that sort of came across in her experiences in nature as well. So she was interested in different colors of the flowers, different smells of the flowers. And I think that sort of helped them create that holistic multisensory experience of the space. So I think that's really, yeah, that was really key in creating mental representations. And then we also have creating mental representations of the spaces for wayfinding and navigation purposes. And we know that from previous research is that a lot of blind and partially sighted people use memory to navigate known routes around their house, for example, or their workspace. So that's really interesting, you know, how that sort of mental mapping of the physical environment for navigation actually translates to open spaces and how they make sense of the environment. I think to your question about, I hope that I answered that question, but I'm happy to sort of answer in the chat as well. With regards to motivating factor behind my my work, I would say that that's basically it. So to understand the experience, how people with different abilities and different disabilities experience different spaces, and then how can we, through technology, make those experiences available and enhance those experiences for people who are otherwise not able to. So I think that's the idea. I had personal motivation for getting into studying sight loss due to my father losing his sight at a later point in his life. But I think that through my research, I've gained a much deeper understanding of how blind and partially sighted people, you know, experience open spaces in nature. And I think to the point what Kathy was saying, that we often, at least that was my understanding before, that we, you know, with accessibility and assistive technology, I personally view that getting access to things was, it's not enough. You know, people, through my research, I've understood that people want to contribute to society. They want to contribute to the betterment of and creating fairer access to different open spaces for other people of different abilities. So yeah, I think that's kind of what my motivation is for my work now and in the future as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that really summarised the answers to those questions, and also the huge question of why you decided to go into that space. So so thank you so much for sharing all of that. We are coming to the end of the session. I can see there's a few questions that have come in specifically for Victor. Just in a bit more detail around guide running and a little bit around interaction between the runner and the physical guide, and a little bit more some of the detail on that. What we'll do is after this session, once we have the recording ready and the transcript, we'll send it around, so you'll have copies of that with a bit more information and contact details, so you can find out a bit more about this project, potentially kind of read some of the publications and whatnot as well. So that's probably about us done for today. So before I wrap up, I'm just going to quickly hand across to Catherine to see if she has any final summary points before we end today's session.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks everybody for joining and for the guys for presenting. I think there's a lot of questions that are still in the chat, which I think we will do our best to answer directly to you. But one of the things was about finding users, you know, when you don't maybe have access to people. And I think one of the biggest things I always tell my PhD students when they're starting is that they need to go and work with groups. They need to find people and make sure that they really kind of immerse themselves in the environment in which they wish to design in. So if it's schools of people who are blind and partially sighted, then go and work and volunteer in those spaces and get to know people and get to really understand the problem space in as broad a context as you can. So that's my overarching advice for how you engage and co-design the problems. And I think through that, you tend to find that you make some good friends and colleagues, whether they be teachers or students or others. And then kind of along the project, there's a little squad that develops the new initiative together. And it gives you more confidence, I think, in moving forward to the next step when you have that kind of diverse set of feedback all of the time. So that's my reflection on today. If you do have any other questions about PhDs and more generally or in the research that we're doing, do reach out. We'd love to hear from you, and we're very happy to talk further at another time. But enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So yeah, so brilliant to have you all join the session today. That's it for Disability Innovation Live. We'll be doing another session next month, so keep an eye on our social media for more information about that. And thank you so much for your questions and reflections, and again to the panel for joining today, and to Claire, who's doing a brilliant job on all the closed captions. Apologies again for a few of those technical challenges, and some of the sound quality. Always difficulty when doing these things over Zoom, but we shall live and learn. So thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again. And